He kicked her without hesitation, her body folding with a gasp that froze the crowded street. What he didn't know, that the man she loved would soon bring his entire world crashing down. The city never really slept. By day it roared with the honks of traffic, the hum of commerce, and the murmurs of a million lives trying to make ends meet. By night, it pulsed with neon lights, whispered secrets, and power games few ever saw. Somewhere between those two worlds sat Jonathan Whitmore, the billionaire's son. If this story resonated with you, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as crazy as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. Jonathan's mornings began with the click of polished shoes across marble floors and the subtle scent of imported cigars that lingered in his father's penthouse. He wasn't a man who had to try. Money and legacy had given him everything. Or at least, that's what he told himself when he stared into the mirror, brushing his perfect hair into place. But behind the curated charm and expensive watch ticking at his wrist was a restlessness. He'd lived 30 years with everything money could buy, but nothing his heart actually craved. A fleeting parade of women, shallow friendships, and late-night arguments with his father filled his days. Respect, love, purpose. These were words he didn't dare speak aloud. To admit he longed for them would mean admitting weakness. So, he wrapped himself in arrogance instead. If life wouldn't give him peace, then power would do. And power he had in abundance. That morning, Jonathan leaned against the railing of his father's penthouse balcony, sipping espresso like it was a performance. He looked down on the city, people appearing as dots moving frantically beneath him. His lips curled into a smirk. Running, always running, for what? He muttered. His phone buzzed, another message about the board meeting he'd ignore until the last moment. He thrived in chaos, or at least, he thought he did. Across town, the world looked very different. Naomi Brooks pressed her hand against her swollen belly as she adjusted her scarf and walked out of the small apartment she shared with her husband. Her pregnancy was showing more now, the soft roundness beneath her dress marking the miracle she carried. At 32, Naomi's life wasn't luxurious, but it was rich in ways money could never measure. The scent of cinnamon from the bakery down the street mixed with the crisp autumn air. She paused for a moment, letting her child kick lightly against her palm. "You feel that, baby? Daddy's gonna be so proud of you," she whispered with a smile. Her husband, David, had already left for work. He was a man who carried quiet strength, one Naomi leaned on in moments of fear. He wasn't just her partner. He was her safe place. Few knew the depth of his story, fewer still the quiet power he held. But Naomi had seen it. And in his love she had found home. Life hadn't been easy for Naomi. Growing up, she faced whispers, stereotypes, doors slammed in her face. She had fought for dignity in spaces that tried to strip it away. But those battles had only deepened her resolve. She carried herself with a grace that silenced rooms, a dignity no cruelty could touch. That morning, she wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and began her walk toward the clinic for her prenatal checkup. Her steps were slower these days, but steady. With every move, she reminded herself, "Asterisk, you are stronger than they think. You are more than they'll ever know. Asterisk." The city was large, yet fate has a way of shrinking distances when two worlds are destined to collide. Jonathan's driver slowed the sleek black car near the heart of downtown. Jonathan, restless as always, demanded to be dropped off, claiming he needed air. The truth was simpler. He wanted to be seen, to feel alive among strangers. His leather jacket contrasted with the suits that knew his name, his careless stride defying the whispers of responsibility tied to his last name. Naomi, meanwhile, approached the same intersection, adjusting her scarf against the sudden gust of wind. She balanced a small paper bag of groceries in one hand, her other hand cradling her belly. She looked tired but serene, the kind of serenity that comes from carrying both life and hope within you. From a distance, they couldn't have looked more different. One dripped with inherited privilege, the other carried quiet resilience. One moved through the world with reckless entitlement, the other with grounded humility. Yet, destiny was already writing the lines that would force them to meet. Jonathan paused at the corner cafe, lighting a cigarette though he barely smoked. A group of young men nearby laughed, nudged one another, and glanced in his direction. He could sense it, the recognition, the envy. "That's him," he imagined them whispering. "The billionaire's son. The Whitmore heir. The one who could do anything by anyone and walk away untouched." But behind that mask of pride, Jonathan's chest tightened. He was tired of being the Whitmore heir. He wanted desperately to be Jonathan. Someone worth loving not for his last name, but for himself. He exhaled smoke into the morning air, chasing away the thought. Across the street, Naomi waited for the light to change, one hand resting protectively over her belly. Her eyes met Jonathan's for the briefest of moments. Not recognition, not yet, but a flicker of curiosity. He looked untouchable. She looked untouchable in a different way. Neither knew that their next encounter would tear open every wall they had built. Have you ever met someone whose life seemed completely opposite to yours, but somehow fate pushed you into crossing paths? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to know. This is where the title's central event unfolds. Jonathan lashes out and kicks Naomi, not realizing the weight of his actions, or who her husband is. The pacing slows down, filled with visceral details, subtext, and emotional fallout. The morning sun had risen higher, throwing long shadows across the busy downtown intersection. People bustled between errands, deliveries, and morning coffee runs. The noise of the city was constant. Horns blaring, conversations spilling into the open air, a child crying somewhere down the block. Naomi waited patiently for the light to change. Her hand pressed protectively against her belly as she shifted the grocery bag from one arm to the other. The baby stirred lightly, as if sensing the world outside. She smiled faintly. Across the street, Jonathan flicked the ash of his cigarette onto the sidewalk and stepped toward the crosswalk. His leather jacket brushed against strangers who moved quickly out of his way. Some recognized him, some didn't, but he carried himself as though the world owed him clearance. And in a sense, it did. His last name bought him space wherever he went. But Jonathan's mood was foul. The earlier phone call from his father still echoed in his mind. Another lecture about responsibility, about the company, about proving yourself. He didn't want responsibility. He wanted freedom. Instead, his life felt like a cage made of gold. The walk sign blinked green. Naomi stepped forward slowly, careful with her footing. The grocery bag shifted again, and an apple rolled free, bouncing onto the pavement. She bent awkwardly to retrieve it, one hand still on her belly. A man in a rush brushed past her shoulder, nearly knocking her off balance. Jonathan saw her stumble as he approached. For a brief second, something in his chest tightened, an instinct maybe to help. But then the laughter of the young men behind him reached his ears. They were watching, waiting to see how Whitmore handled himself in public. And Jonathan, angry, restless, desperate to prove he was untouchable, made a choice. "Watch where you're going," he barked, stepping too close. Before Naomi could steady herself, his foot lashed out, kicking her grocery bag from her hand. The force jolted through her, her body folding slightly as she gasped in pain. The world seemed to freeze. The paper bag tore, fruit scattering across the concrete. Naomi staggered back, one hand clutching her belly. The kick hadn't landed fully on her body, but the shock, the sudden jolt, sent a sharp ache through her side. Her face contorted with pain and tears welled in her eyes, not just from the physical blow, but from the humiliation of being struck in public while carrying life within her. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman shrieked. Someone yelled, "Hey! What's your problem?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. For a split second, regret flickered in his expression, but pride smothered it instantly. He stood tall, sneering. "She was in the way," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, as if the cruelty could mask the insecurity boiling inside him. Naomi's breathing grew shallow. She sank onto a nearby bench, clutching her belly as though shielding her unborn child from the world's violence. Her eyes glistened with hurt, but she refused to cry out. She would not give him that satisfaction. A man from the crowd stepped forward. "You just kicked a pregnant woman," he shouted, voice trembling with outrage. Others echoed, "Yeah, she's pregnant, you jerk." Jonathan's heart pounded in his ears. He wanted to snap back to shut them up, but the weight of the stairs pressed down on him. Cameras glinted in hands. Phones recording. Suddenly, the arrogance didn't feel so steady. His smirk faltered. Still, he couldn't back down. Apologizing in public would mean weakness. It would mean proving his father right, that he wasn't strong enough to handle the world. So, he turned sharply, striding toward the corner cafe without a glance back. His voice cut the air. "Mind your own business." But Naomi's eyes followed him, wide and filled with fire despite her pain. She pressed her palm harder against her belly, whispering to herself, "You're okay, baby. You're okay. I've got you." The crowd swarmed her, some offering water, others demanding to call the police. But Naomi shook her head, lips trembling. "No police," she whispered. She couldn't, at least not yet. There were reasons. Reasons tied to her husband, reasons she didn't owe strangers in this moment. Her focus was on the life within her, on keeping her baby safe. Yet deep inside, her heart trembled. Not from fear, but from the spark of something far larger. She didn't know yet how, but this single moment, this kick, this humiliation, would ripple outward, dragging Jonathan, herself, and her husband into a storm none of them could escape. Jonathan retreated into the cafe, chest heaving. He ordered an espresso he didn't want, fingers drumming on the counter. His reflection in the glass window stared back at him, jaw clenched, eyes darker than he remembered. He replayed the moment in his head. The look on her face. The way she had clutched her belly. The sharp silence of the crowd before their voices erupted. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt the smallest crack in his armor. He shoved the thought down, drowning it in bitter coffee. He didn't know her name, didn't care, or at least that's what he told himself. But the truth? The truth was already clawing its way into his conscience. Outside, Naomi sat trembling. A kind stranger handed her a bottle of water. Her hands shook as she took it, sipping slowly. She forced herself to steady her breath. "You're stronger than this. You have to be." But as she looked down at her belly, tears slid silently down her cheeks. She whispered to the life within, "I promise you, your daddy will never let anyone hurt us. Never." Her voice was soft, but the conviction was fierce. Because what Jonathan Whitmore didn't know, what none of the gawking strangers knew, was that Naomi's husband was not a man to be trifled with. And soon, Jonathan's arrogance would collide headfirst with a love stronger than all his privilege. If you witnessed someone powerful publicly humiliating or hurting someone vulnerable, would you step in or stay silent? Share honestly in the comments. Here, both characters retreat into denial and conflict. Jonathan resists the shame of what he's done. Naomi resists the urge to make it a public scandal. The tension thickens. The city had moved on. Cars rushed, shops reopened, voices carried across the sidewalks like nothing had happened. But for Jonathan and Naomi, time refused to reset. The spark of that moment lingered, echoing in both of them long after the crowd dispersed. Jonathan slouched in the back of his father's car as it sped toward the Whitmore estate. He had ordered his driver to pick him up from the cafe, too restless to walk. He sank into the leather seat, staring at the skyline flashing by. The memory of Naomi's face wouldn't leave him. The way she bent to shield her belly, the way the crowd had turned on him like wolves. His chest tightened. It was just a bag of groceries, he told himself. I barely touched her. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had seen the pain in her eyes. Jonathan clenched his fists. Regret prickled beneath his skin, but shame was a poison he refused to drink. They were overreacting, he muttered aloud, as if the empty car needed convincing. If she can't handle being in public, that's her problem. The driver shifted slightly in the front seat but said nothing. Jonathan hated that silence. Silence always felt like judgment. By the time the car pulled into the long driveway of the Whitmore estate, Jonathan's pride had armored itself again. He stepped out, shoulders squared, jaw set. Whatever guilt gnawed at him would stay buried. He had been raised to never show weakness. Meanwhile, Naomi sat quietly at the clinic. A nurse's gentle voice guided her through a series of checks. Blood pressure, heart rate, the baby's heartbeat thudding softly through the monitor. Relief washed over her at the sound. Her child was still safe. But Naomi's mind wasn't calm. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jonathan's face, twisted with cruelty. Her hand trembled as she held her belly, whispering a silent prayer. When the doctor reassured her that both she and the baby were fine, Naomi forced a smile. But the doctor's final words lingered. Just avoid stress, Mrs. Brooks. It's not good for you or the baby. Naomi nodded, though inside she wanted to laugh bitterly. Avoid stress? After what just happened? Her pride urged her to call David immediately, to let her husband storm into the city and demand justice. But another part of her resisted. She knew David, knew the fire in his soul. If he found out, the situation wouldn't end quietly. And right now Naomi wanted peace, not chaos. She whispered again to her belly as she left the clinic. Daddy will know soon enough. But not today. Today it's just us. That evening, Jonathan sat in the grand dining room of the estate, across from his father, Richard Whitmore. The table stretched endlessly between them, lined with silverware polished so brightly it gleamed. Richard's eyes bored into his son. What was it this time? He demanded. I've already received 2 calls. Videos are circulating. People are saying you assaulted a pregnant woman downtown. Is it true? Jonathan's pulse quickened. He had hoped the story wouldn't spread, at least not this quickly. But of course in this city, everything Whitmore touched turned into gossip. It's exaggerated, Jonathan said flatly, stabbing at his steak. She was careless. I barely touched her. Richard's jaw tightened. Barely touched her. Jonathan, this family cannot survive another scandal. Do you understand what you've done? Jonathan threw his fork down. What I've done? I've spent my entire life suffocating under your rules, your name, your company. One mistake in public and suddenly it's the end of the world. Richard leaned forward, his voice low and cutting. This isn't about one mistake. It's about who you are becoming. And right now you're proving to the world you're nothing but a spoiled, reckless boy. The words hit harder than Jonathan expected. For a fleeting moment, shame burned inside him. But pride surged to cover it. He pushed back from the table. Maybe I don't care what the world thinks. Maybe I don't care what you think. And with that, he stormed from the room, his father's disappointment echoing behind him. Naomi returned home to the small apartment that evening, exhausted. David wasn't back yet. She sank onto the couch, the day's weight pressing down on her. She thought about calling her best friend, Leah, but hesitated. Telling the story would make it more real. And Naomi didn't want to feel like a victim. Not tonight. Instead, she leaned back, closing her eyes. Memories of her past crept in. The years of fighting to be respected in rooms that dismissed her. The constant whispers about her race, her body, her worth. She had built walls of dignity to survive it all. But Jonathan's kick had cracked something in those walls, if only for a moment. Tears slid down her cheeks silently. She wasn't weak, she knew that. But carrying life inside her made her vulnerability sharper. She whispered to herself, "You are more than what they do to you. You always have been." Jonathan lay awake that night in his penthouse suite, staring at the ceiling. The city lights bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but none of it felt like home. His chest felt hollow. He thought again of Naomi's eyes. Not just the pain in them, but the strength too. She hadn't screamed at him. She hadn't cursed. She had simply endured, silent and unbroken. And that silence haunted him more than any insult could have. He rolled over, burying his face in the pillow. "Forget her," he muttered. But he couldn't. Because deep down, Jonathan knew this wasn't over. This is where it gets juicy. The city had its own rhythm, a strange pulse that sometimes pulled strangers into the same orbit, no matter how desperately they tried to avoid it. For Jonathan and Naomi, that pull came sooner than either expected. Naomi sat in the waiting room of St. Luke's Community Clinic a week later, her shawl draped around her shoulders. The checkup was routine, but her nerves weren't. Every time she entered a medical space, her heart raced, not for herself, but for the tiny heartbeat inside her. She smoothed her dress with trembling fingers, whispering under her breath, "Stay strong, baby." David had offered to come, but Naomi insisted he go to work. Bills didn't pay themselves, and besides, she didn't want him hovering with worry. He would sense something was wrong, and she wasn't ready, not yet, to relive what had happened. The nurse at the desk called her name. Naomi rose slowly, adjusting her bag, and moved toward the hallway leading to the exam rooms. She didn't notice the tall figure striding in through the clinic's main doors at that exact moment. Jonathan Whitmore had no intention of stepping foot in a place like St. Luke's. His life was spent in private hospitals, elite offices, and five-star spaces. But he hadn't come for himself. His father had forced him. Community outreach, Richard Whitmore had called it. Do some public good, Jonathan. Take the cameras, shake hands, show the world you're not just another spoiled heir. Our foundation supports this clinic. Act like it matters. So here he was, reluctant, irritated, but trapped. His assistant trailed behind him, clipboard in hand, reminding him of the photo ops. Jonathan shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, scanning the room with disinterest. Patients sat in faded plastic chairs, children fidgeted with worn toys, and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic mixed with baby powder. It felt worlds away from his penthouse life. He sighed. Let's get this over with. Naomi froze when she heard his voice. That voice. Cold, sharp, arrogant. Her stomach dropped. Slowly she turned. And there he was. Jonathan Whitmore, strolling into the clinic like he owned it. His entourage buzzing around him. Her chest tightened. Memories of the kick, the humiliation, the pain surged back. Instinctively, she placed her hand over her belly, protective as ever. Their eyes met across the room. Jonathan stopped in his tracks. For a moment, the mask slipped. Recognition flashed in his gaze, followed quickly by something else. Shame. Regret. Fear. Naomi's heart pounded. She wanted to look away, to flee, but her feet rooted to the floor. Her body trembled with anger, with the weight of what he had done. Jonathan's assistant whispered, "Sir, the board members are waiting in the conference room." But Jonathan didn't move. His gaze remained locked on Naomi, her presence cutting through the sterile room like a blade. Minutes later, fate made the situation unavoidable. The clinic director, eager to impress the Whitmore Foundation, ushered Jonathan on a tour. They walked him through hallways, pointing out new equipment, introducing staff. Eventually, they reached the maternity wing, where Naomi sat waiting outside an exam room. "Ah, Mrs. Brooks," the director said warmly. "This is Naomi Brooks, one of our long-term patients. She's expecting soon." Naomi's head snapped toward him, eyes wide. Her lips parted to protest, but the words died in her throat. Jonathan's chest constricted. He forced a polite smile, but the weight in his gut was crushing. "Congratulations," he said, his voice softer than he intended. Naomi's jaw tightened. She rose slowly from her chair, standing tall despite the tremor in her hands. "Congratulations," she repeated, her voice laced with quiet fury. "That's rich coming from you." The director glanced between them, puzzled. "Do you two know each other?" Naomi's eyes burned into Jonathan's. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Jonathan swallowed hard, pride warring with guilt. He forced a chuckle. "Just a brief encounter downtown. Isn't that right, Mrs. Brooks?" Naomi's lips curved into a bitter smile. "Oh, we've met. Brief but unforgettable." The tension was palpable. The director, sensing something beneath the surface, cleared his throat awkwardly and ushered Jonathan toward the next room. But Jonathan's steps faltered. His pride wanted to walk away, but something anchored him there. Her eyes, her voice, the fire she carried even in silence. Later, as cameras clicked and Jonathan posed with staff, his mind kept drifting back to Naomi. He could feel her presence down the hall like a pulse. The memory of her trembling hands on her belly replayed in his head, taunting him. And Naomi, sitting in the exam room, couldn't shake the bitterness. To see him here, parading as a philanthropist, smiling for cameras while she still carried the bruise of his cruelty in her heart, it was almost too much. As fate would have it, their paths collided once more before Jonathan left. Naomi exited the clinic just as Jonathan's car pulled up. She moved slowly, clutching her bag, when she heard footsteps behind her. "Wait!" The voice froze her. She turned, and there he was. Jonathan, without his assistant, without the cameras, just him. His expression was different now. Less armor, more hesitation. Naomi narrowed her eyes. "What do you want?" Jonathan's mouth opened, then closed. Words failed him. Apologizing felt impossible. But silence was worse. Finally, he muttered, "I didn't mean for it to happen like that." Naomi's laugh was sharp, bitter. "You didn't mean to. You kicked a pregnant woman, Mr. Whitmore. That's not something you stumble into." Jonathan flinched at her words. He shoved his hands deeper into his pockets, avoiding her gaze. "I was angry. He stopped, realizing excuses sounded pathetic. Naomi's voice trembled, but her stare was steady. "You think your anger gives you the right to hurt people? To humiliate them? You don't even know what you could have taken from me." Her hand pressed to her belly, her voice breaking slightly. "From us." Jonathan's throat tightened. Shame surged, raw and unfiltered. For the first time, he couldn't hide behind arrogance. He whispered almost to himself, "I'm sorry." Naomi's eyes widened. For a heartbeat, she saw something human in him. Fragile, conflicted. But just as quickly, her walls went back up. "Sorry won't erase what you did," she said coldly. Then she turned, walking away without another glance. Jonathan stood rooted to the sidewalk, her words echoing in his chest. He had spent his life untouchable, But somehow, this woman had pierced straight through his armor. And it terrified him. If you were Naomi, would you accept Jonathan's apology, or walk away as she did? Share your perspective in the comments. The days after the clinic encounter felt heavy for Naomi. She tried to focus on small routines, folding baby clothes, cooking simple meals, humming lullabies to the tiny life within her. But her mind kept circling back to Jonathan. His face, his hesitation, his apology. It wasn't forgiveness she felt. Far from it. But there was something unsettling about seeing vulnerability in the same man who had humiliated her. And worse, she hadn't told David yet. The secret weighed on her like an anchor. David Brooks came home late that Thursday evening, his jacket dusted with the chill of autumn air. He set his briefcase down and smiled at the sight of Naomi curled on the couch with a baby blanket across her lap. "Long day?" she asked gently, rising to meet him. He kissed her forehead, his hands lingering protectively on her shoulders. "Always. But worth it if I get to come home to you." Naomi smiled, though the ache in her chest deepened. David had always been her anchor, her protector. She remembered the first time she'd met him, at a community event years ago, where his quiet charisma drew her in. He wasn't loud or flashy, but when he spoke, people listened. There was a presence about him that commanded respect. What most didn't know, what Naomi sometimes forgot the world didn't see, was the weight David carried outside their home. He wasn't just a husband or an expectant father. He was a man of significant influence, a man whose decisions shaped more lives than most would ever realize. His leadership in community development, his network of allies, his voice in city politics. David Brooks was no ordinary man. Naomi leaned into his embrace, her heart torn. She wanted to tell him, but she also knew his fire. If David learned that Jonathan Whitmore had hurt her, his response would be explosive. And Naomi wasn't ready for that storm. Not yet. So she kept silent, holding him tighter instead. Across the city, Jonathan sat in his penthouse, staring at a half-empty glass of whiskey. He hadn't told anyone about the woman, about Naomi. He had lied to himself for years, but he couldn't lie this time. The memory haunted him. For the first time in his life, Jonathan felt a sting of remorse that didn't fade after a night of drinking. He could still see the way Naomi's hand clutched her belly, hear the tremor in her voice as she said, asterisk, "You don't even know what you could have taken from me." Asterisk. And the truth was, he didn't. He didn't know her story, her life, her husband. All he knew was that she carried herself with a dignity that mocked his arrogance. Jonathan poured another drink, but the liquid burned more bitterly than usual. He thought of his father's lectures, of the way Richard's disappointment cut deeper than any insult. He thought of his mother, long gone, but remembered in whispers. She had been the only one who ever made him feel seen. Her absence had left a wound that wealth could never heal. And maybe, just maybe, Jonathan wondered if his cruelty toward others was only a reflection of his anger at himself. Naomi visited her best friend Leah the next afternoon. They sat in Leah's kitchen, sipping tea, the smell of fresh bread wafting through the air. Leah was the only person Naomi could trust with the truth. When Naomi told her what Jonathan had done, Leah's eyes widened with fury. "He kicked you. While you're pregnant." Naomi nodded, tears threatening. "I didn't tell David. I can't, not yet." Leah slammed her hand on the table. "Naomi, he deserves to know. Do you realize who your husband is? If David finds out Whitmore touched you." "I know," Naomi cut in sharply, her voice trembling. "That's exactly why I haven't told him. David won't just confront him. He'll destroy him. And I don't want that fight. Not while I'm carrying this baby." Leah softened, reaching for her hand. "But you can't carry this alone. Jonathan doesn't get to walk away like nothing happened. Naomi looked down, her hand cradling her belly. I'm not protecting Jonathan. I'm protecting David. And this child. Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truth. Meanwhile, Jonathan's father pushed harder. Your recklessness has consequences, Jonathan, Richard Whitmore snapped one evening in his office. I've had meetings canceled, deals questioned, all because of your public behavior. If you don't get control of yourself, you'll drag this entire family down. Jonathan bristled. You think I don't know that? You think I don't hear the whispers? But you never cared about me, only about the family name. Richard's eyes hardened. You're right. The name comes first. Always has, always will. If you want respect, earn it. The words sliced deep. For Jonathan, everything always came back to respect, to proving he was more than his last name. And yet, here he was, failing again. One night, Jonathan drove aimlessly through the city, the streets blurring past him. He didn't know where he was going until he stopped in front of St. Luke's Clinic. The building glowed softly in the dark, its windows lit by the faint hum of night staff. He sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel, fighting an urge he didn't understand. He wanted to see her. Not to hurt her, not to argue, but to understand her. Naomi, at that very moment, was at home reading in bed, unaware that the man who had wounded her sat parked across town, restless with guilt he didn't know how to name. The past was unraveling for both of them. Naomi wrestled with the ghosts of her struggles, her fear of igniting her husband's fury. Jonathan wrestled with the ghost of his mother, his father's disappointment, and the shame of his own cruelty. And beneath it all, fate was weaving their stories tighter, dragging them toward a collision that neither could avoid. Do you think Naomi is right to protect David from the truth for now? Or is she risking too much by keeping it secret? Share your honest thoughts in the comments. The first autumn rains had swept through the city, leaving streets slick and shimmering with reflections of neon signs. Naomi walked carefully, her umbrella shielding her from the drizzle. She was on her way back from the clinic after another routine appointment, her mind preoccupied with the baby's steady heartbeat she'd heard just hours earlier. That sound always anchored her. She rounded a corner, and there he was again. Jonathan, leaning against his car, damp from the mist, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. His gaze snapped to her, nervous but determined. Naomi froze. Her grip on the umbrella tightened. What do you want? She asked, her voice firm but edged with fatigue. Jonathan swallowed hard. I just wanted to make sure you're okay. Naomi let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Now you care? I cared then too, Jonathan said quickly, his words tumbling out. He stopped himself, raking a hand through his wet hair. I handled it badly. Stupidly. I've been thinking about it every day since. Naomi shook her head. Thinking doesn't undo what you did. I know, Jonathan admitted, his voice quieter now. But it's all I've got. For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the drizzle on the pavement. Naomi's chest tightened. She hated that she could see sincerity flickering in his eyes. She wanted to dismiss him, to shut the door on this moment. And yet something in her gut told her to listen, if only for her own closure. Why? She asked softly. Why are you even here? Jonathan hesitated, his jaw tightening. Because, when I saw your face that day and the way you protected your baby, it shook me. I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of, but this, it won't leave me. Naomi stared at him, searching for cracks in his armor. And she found them, not excuses, not arrogance, but a rawness she hadn't expected. Later that week, fate placed them together again, this time inside the clinic's small waiting room during a power outage. Naomi had come in for a blood test. Jonathan was there, reluctantly attending another foundation tour. The storm outside knocked out the lights, leaving the room dim and hushed, only emergency lanterns casting a glow. The staff bustled to fix things, but for the patients it meant waiting. Naomi sat alone in a corner, cradling her belly. Jonathan sat across the room, restless, trying not to glance her way. But the silence pressed on them both until Jonathan finally spoke. "Do you know if it's a boy or a girl?" Naomi blinked, surprised by the question. "A girl," she said cautiously. Jonathan's lips twitched in the faintest smile. "That's beautiful. Girls have a way of softening even the hardest men. My mother—" He stopped abruptly, his throat tightening. Naomi tilted her head, curious despite herself. "Your mother?" Jonathan stared at the floor. "She died when I was young. She was the only one who really saw me. Everyone else just sees Whitmore. The name. The money. The air. But she—" His voice trailed off, raw with grief he rarely let surface. Naomi's chest softened. She hadn't expected this honesty. "Losing her must have been hard," she said gently. Jonathan nodded, eyes glistening in the dim light. "I think I've been angry ever since. Angry at her for leaving, at my father for never caring, at myself for not being enough." Naomi studied him quietly. For the first time, she saw not the arrogant heir, but a broken man hiding behind walls of cruelty. She shifted slightly, her voice steady. "You hurt me. You humiliated me. But if you want to stop being that angry man, it starts with owning what you've done. Not just with me, but with yourself." Jonathan's throat tightened. "I'm trying. God help me, I'm trying." The storm dragged on, keeping them there longer than either expected. Hours passed. At one point, Naomi's baby kicked hard, and she winced, pressing her belly. Jonathan noticed immediately. "You okay?" he asked, leaning forward instinctively. Naomi hesitated, then nodded. "She's just reminding me she's here." A faint smile tugged at Jonathan's lips. "She's a fighter like her mom." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Don't flatter me. You don't know me." "Maybe not," Jonathan said softly. "But I want to." The words lingered, vulnerable and unexpected. Naomi's heart thudded. She wasn't ready to forgive him. She didn't even know if she ever could. But in that moment, she saw the possibility of change. When the lights finally flickered back on, Naomi stood to leave. Jonathan rose too, his voice low. "Thank you for not shutting me out completely." Naomi's gaze was steady. "Don't thank me. I haven't forgiven you. Not even close. But maybe I see you a little differently now." Jonathan nodded, accepting the scraps of grace like a starving man. That night, Naomi sat on her bed, hand on her belly, replaying the conversation. Against her will, Jonathan's brokenness had stirred something inside her. A strange blend of pity, understanding, and caution. And Jonathan, lying awake in his penthouse, replayed Naomi's words. Asterisk, it starts with owning what you've done. Asterisk, for the first time, he believed it might be possible. The fragile bond between them wasn't forgiveness, wasn't love, but it was something. A seed. And seeds, given time, could grow. Do you think Jonathan's vulnerability is genuine? Or is it just another mask? Could someone like him truly change? Share your perspective below. I'm curious what you think. The bond between Naomi and Jonathan had been fragile, like glass held too close to the edge of a table. And like glass, it didn't take much to send it crashing to the floor. It happened on a Friday evening. David had invited Naomi to accompany him to a gala dinner at the Grand Regent Hotel. He rarely asked her to join his professional functions, He liked to shield her from the scrutiny of high society, but this one mattered. It was a fundraiser for urban renewal, with leaders from across the city attending. Naomi dressed carefully, her growing belly visible beneath a flowing gown. David beamed when he saw her. "You look radiant," he said, kissing her cheek. She smiled, but her heart carried a secret weight. She hadn't told David about Jonathan, about the apology, about the strange, vulnerable conversations they'd shared. Tonight, she feared that silence might come crashing down on her. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and murmurs of power. Men in tailored suits shook hands. Women in gowns exchanged air kisses. Naomi clutched David's arm, her anchor in the sea of polished faces. Then her stomach dropped. Across the room, laughing with investors, stood Jonathan Whitmore. Dressed in black tie, his arrogance was back in place, but Naomi, who had glimpsed the man behind the mask, could see the cracks in his smile. Jonathan's eyes found hers instantly. His laughter faltered, and for a moment, the noise of the ballroom faded. Naomi felt her breath catch. She turned quickly back to David, praying he hadn't noticed. But David's gaze followed hers. "You know him." Naomi stiffened. "Everyone knows the Whitmores," she said carefully. David's eyes narrowed. He had a way of sensing truths hidden in silences. But before he could press, Jonathan approached. "David Brooks," Jonathan said smoothly, extending his hand. "An honor. I've heard much about your work." David shook his hand, his grip firm, his eyes unflinching. "Mr. Whitmore." Jonathan's gaze flickered to Naomi. "Mrs. Brooks." Naomi forced a polite nod, but her heart thundered. The tension between them was a wire pulled taut, invisible but dangerous. Throughout the evening, Naomi avoided Jonathan's gaze, but fate wasn't kind. During the dinner, the seating chart placed them at the same table. Jonathan across from Naomi, David at her side. The conversation flowed around them. Politics, investments, philanthropy. But beneath the surface, a storm brewed. Jonathan's eyes kept straying toward Naomi, and David noticed every flicker. At one point, when Naomi excused herself to step away, Jonathan followed. He found her near the terrace, hands gripping the railing. "You shouldn't be here," Naomi hissed. Jonathan's voice was low, urgent. "I didn't know you were David's wife." Naomi spun toward him, eyes blazing. "And what difference would that make?" Jonathan hesitated. "Everything. He's powerful, respected, and he loves you. If he finds out..." Her jaw tightened. "If he finds out what? That you kicked me? That you've been haunting me with apologies and half-truths? That despite myself, I've listened?" Jonathan flinched. His pride wanted to argue, but his shame silenced him. Unfortunately, neither noticed David approaching. He had followed, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. "Naomi." David's voice cut through the night air. Naomi froze. Jonathan straightened, his mask snapping back into place. David's gaze swept between them, suspicion hardening into anger. "What is going on here?" Naomi opened her mouth, but Jonathan spoke first. "Nothing," he said quickly. "I was just apologizing for..." Naomi's sharp intake of breath stopped him, but it was too late. David's face darkened. Apologizing for what? Naomi's lips trembled. She wanted to speak, to explain carefully, but her silence was its own confession. David's fury ignited. "Did he hurt you?" David demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Naomi's eyes filled with tears. "David, please." Jonathan tried to interject, but David stepped forward, his presence towering. "You touched my wife." His voice thundered now, drawing the attention of nearby guests. Naomi reached for his arm. "David, not here, please." But David's wrath had been unleashed. "Do you know who I am, Whitmore? Do you understand what you've done?" Jonathan's pride surged, clashing with guilt. "I know exactly who you are. And I'm not afraid of you." The words hung heavy, reckless. Naomi's heart broke. The fragile bond she and Jonathan had built was shattered, twisted into a weapon against her marriage. Security intervened, pulling the men apart before fists could fly. Guests whispered. Phones captured snippets of the scene. The Brooks name, the Whitmore name, both now tangled in scandal. Naomi, trembling, clutched her belly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "This is exactly what I feared," she whispered. David turned to her, his expression torn between fury and betrayal. "Why didn't you tell me?" Naomi couldn't answer. She felt trapped between the husband she loved and the man who, against all odds, had shown her a broken humanity she couldn't ignore. Jonathan, chest heaving, watched her with something like desperation. But Naomi couldn't look at him. The night ended in chaos, leaving Naomi alone in her grief, Jonathan drowning in shame, and David burning with rage. The bond was shattered, and it seemed beyond repair. If you were Naomi, would you have told David from the beginning? Or was she right to try to protect him until it exploded? Drop your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your perspective. The scandal from the gala spread like wildfire. Within hours, photos and shaky videos circulated online. David Brooks, the respected community leader, confronting Jonathan Whitmore, heir to one of the city's wealthiest families. Whispers filled newsrooms and dinner tables alike. The story had all the ingredients: wealth, betrayal, and drama. But for Naomi, it wasn't headlines that broke her. It was the silence at home. David barely spoke to her for days. He moved through the house like a storm contained in human form. Quiet, simmering, unpredictable. He loved her, that much she knew, but the fact that she hadn't told him what Jonathan had done cut him deeply. One evening, as Naomi folded baby clothes in the nursery, David stood in the doorway. His face was tired, but his eyes burned. "Why?" he asked simply. Naomi's throat tightened. "Because I was afraid," she whispered. "Afraid of exactly what happened. That you'd explode. That you'd fight him. That our lives would be dragged through the mud." David stepped closer. "Do you have any idea what it felt like? To stand there and realize my wife had been hurt, and I was the last to know." Tears welled in Naomi's eyes. "I wasn't protecting him, David. I was protecting you. And our child." David's jaw clenched. He turned away, his hands gripping the doorframe. "You should have trusted me." Naomi's heart broke at the distance between them. Meanwhile, Jonathan sat alone in his penthouse, the city glittering outside his window. For once, the lights of the skyline didn't comfort him, they mocked him. His father's fury had been swift. "Do you understand what you've done? You've embarrassed this family. You've made enemies we cannot afford. The Brooks name carries weight you clearly don't understand." Jonathan had fired back, but his father's words cut deep. He knew Richard was right. He had lashed out, let pride rule him again, and now Naomi, the one person who had begun to see him differently, would never forgive him. He replayed the moment on the terrace over and over. If he had just walked away. If he had just kept his mouth shut. Instead, he had ruined everything. And yet, deep inside, he knew he had to make a choice. Either retreat into the bitter shell that had defined him for years, or step into the vulnerability Naomi had demanded of him. For the first time, Jonathan wanted the latter. But he didn't know if it was too late. Naomi found herself torn between two men. Her loyalty and love belonged to David. Always. He was her husband, her protector, the father of her child. But Jonathan's apology, his brokenness, his humanity, It had unsettled her in ways she couldn't explain. She didn't want him, but she wanted him to change. She wanted to believe people like him could change. One night, as she lay awake listening to David's breathing beside her, she whispered into the dark, "What do I do, God? How do I hold this family together while my heart aches with truths I never asked for?" The silence gave no answers. The next day, Naomi received a letter. Hand-delivered, unmarked. Her heart raced when she recognized the handwriting. Jonathan's. She hesitated before opening it, but curiosity won. The letter was short, raw. "Naomi, I've ruined everything. I don't expect forgiveness. But please believe me, I am trying. You were right. Change begins with owning what I've done. And I will. Even if it costs me everything. Jonathan." Naomi's hands trembled. She folded the letter, tucking it away before David could see. It wasn't love she felt, it was possibility. The possibility that even broken men could rise from their wreckage. Later that evening, David confronted her again, his voice heavy. "I need to know," he said. "Do you still trust me? After everything?" Naomi turned toward him, her eyes brimming with tears. "With my life. With our baby. Always." David studied her, the anger in his gaze softening into something more vulnerable. "Hurt. Then why do I feel like I'm losing you?" Naomi stepped closer, pressing her hand to his chest. "Because I was trying to carry too much alone. I didn't want to add to your burdens. But I should have trusted you with mine." David exhaled, his forehead resting against hers. For the first time in days, the wall between them cracked. Elsewhere, Jonathan made his own choice. He scheduled a press conference, against his father's wishes. Reporters crowded into a hall as Jonathan stood at the podium, his face pale but resolute. "I've made mistakes," he began, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Grave ones. I hurt someone who deserved nothing but respect. I've lived selfishly, recklessly, and it's time I own that. Not for the sake of my family's reputation, but for myself." Cameras flashed. Reporters gasped. For the first time in his life, Jonathan wasn't hiding behind money or arrogance. He was choosing truth, no matter the cost. And though Naomi wasn't there, watching from her living room, she felt her chest tighten. He was doing exactly what she had demanded. Owning it. 3 people. 3 choices. Naomi choosing to rebuild trust with her husband. David choosing whether his anger would destroy or strengthen his marriage. Jonathan choosing redemption, even at the cost of his pride. The stage was set for resolution. But the wounds still ran deep. Do you think Jonathan's public confession was brave? Or was it too little, too late? And should David forgive Naomi for keeping the secret? Or is that wound too deep? Share your take in the comments. The days following Jonathan's public confession were heavy with anticipation. His name dominated headlines. Some praised his courage. Others dismissed it as a publicity stunt. But for Naomi, the words weren't about the press, they were about him. He had done what she asked, owned his mistakes. Whether it was enough to redeem him, Naomi didn't know. But it stirred something in her heart, an odd mixture of closure and hope. At home, the atmosphere slowly shifted. David, though still bruised by betrayal of silence, began to thaw. One evening, Naomi found him in the nursery, holding a tiny onesie with tears in his eyes. "She's almost here," he whispered. Naomi stepped beside him, slipping her hand into his. "I'm sorry I hurt you by not telling you sooner. You're my partner, David. I need to trust you with all of me." David turned, his jaw trembling. "And I need to protect you. That's who I am. But maybe Maybe I need to learn protection doesn't always mean war. Naomi leaned into him, relief washing over her. For the first time in weeks, they held each other without anger between them. Their bond, though shaken, was mending. Stronger, perhaps, for having been tested. Meanwhile, Jonathan found himself isolated. His father raged at him, business allies distanced themselves, and social circles whispered behind closed doors. But for the first time in his life, Jonathan didn't care about their approval. He had faced himself and lived. One evening, alone in his apartment, he poured his last bottle of whiskey down the sink. He stared at the empty glass, his reflection staring back at him. "No more hiding," he murmured. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew this. He would no longer be the man who hurt Naomi Brooks. Weeks passed. The city buzzed with holiday lights as winter approached. Naomi's due date drew near, her body heavy but her spirit lighter. David was more present than ever, tender and protective, their love rekindled by forgiveness. Then, one cold December night, it happened. Naomi went into labor. David rushed her to St. Luke's clinic, his heart pounding as he held her hand. Hours of pain, of struggle, of sweat and tears, and then, at last, the cry of new life filled the room. "A girl," the nurse announced with a smile, placing the tiny bundle in Naomi's arms. Naomi wept, holding her daughter close. David leaned over, his tears falling freely. "She's perfect," he whispered. Naomi looked up at him, her heart bursting. "She's ours." Later, as David made calls to family and friends, Naomi lay in bed cradling her baby. Exhausted but glowing, she whispered to her daughter, "You are the reason I fought through every storm. You are love made flesh." The door creaked open, and to her surprise, Jonathan stood there, hesitant and uninvited. David wasn't in the room. Naomi stiffened, protective instinct rising. "What are you doing here?" Jonathan's hands lifted empty. His voice was low, reverent. "I just wanted to see that you're okay. That she's okay." Naomi studied him, torn between anger and understanding. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," Jonathan said softly. His eyes glistened. "But I needed to say, thank you. For forcing me to face myself. For not letting me stay the monster I was." Naomi looked down at her daughter, then back at him. "I don't forgive you. Not fully. But I believe you're trying." Jonathan nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. "That's more than I deserve." He lingered for a moment, then stepped back. "Goodbye, Naomi. Goodbye, little one." He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, David entered. The air froze. David's fists clenched, but Naomi's voice cut in quickly. "David, wait." David's eyes burned. "Why is he here?" Naomi held his gaze steadily. "To say goodbye." Jonathan swallowed hard. "You have what I'll never have, a family that's real. Don't let anger steal that from you." For the first time, David saw not the arrogant heir, but a broken man trying to rise from his ruins. He stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "If you ever come near my wife again, it won't end with words. But tonight go, and make the man you're trying to be worth something." Jonathan nodded. He left quietly, swallowed by the corridor's shadows. Weeks later, Naomi sat by the window, rocking her daughter in her arms. Snow fell softly outside, blanketing the city in white. David came behind her, wrapping his arms around both of them. "She's the best part of us," he whispered. Naomi leaned back into him, her eyes misting. "We made it through, David. Stronger." David kissed her hair. "Love at last," he murmured. Naomi smiled, gazing at her daughter's peaceful face. "Unexpected love," she whispered. Not just the love between husband and wife or parent and child, but the unexpected truth that even broken people could find redemption. Some wounds left scars, but scars could remind you of the battles you'd survived and the love that carried you through. Do you believe people like Jonathan truly deserve second chances? Or should some mistakes mark you forever? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. See you tomorrow.